1, 2.
It works.
It does
Yeah.
now. Didn't before.
It does not.
1, 2. Testing. 1, 2.
Yours is working? What about mine is
Yours
also
is on.
working?
Yours is on.
Oh, perfect.
1, 2. Testing. 1, 2, 1, 2. Testing. 1, 2, 1, 2.
Colleagues online confirm.
I'm just. Well, hello to everybody, and thank you very much for joining us today, both here in Bonn and online. You will have noticed from the title, we're going to hear from or about the 1 billion people who've been absent to a large extent, and I think completely, from climate processes and decisions. Of course, that 1 billion is persons with disabilities. My name is Jamie Williams, and I'm really honoured to be invited to moderate this session today. I'm Senior Policy Advisor for Islamic Relief Worldwide, dealing with poverty reduction, and I have a special brief for climate adaptation. I speak on adaptation for the Climate Action Network constituency at the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Before we start, I need to remind that we do have virtual participants online, and they can post questions in the chat. My colleague will monitor the chat, and if time allows, we'll be able to address questions to the panelists. We also have international sign interpretation and captioning available for the event. As some of you know, the deaf and hard of hearing communicate via sign language, and also some of them use captioning to follow conversations. So this is their right and everybody's responsibility to ensure that all the information and communication is provided in captioning and sign language. The ICT team, thank you guys, they're very busy still setting things up, have worked very hard in the last few days to facilitate captioning and international sign interpretation on the virtual page. We've also shared a Zoom link and the YouTube link to follow the event. The good news is that the UNFCCC and disability groups are working to ensure for COP27 that this problem is solved, so that deaf and hard of hearing colleagues can use YouTube and the virtual platform to participate. For now, though, I'd request all speakers and anyone taking the floor to please speak clearly, not too fast, and to avoid using jargon. And if you use acronyms, please explain what they mean. Okay, so we'll turn to our presenters, some of whom are with us virtually. First, to set the scene and understand the impact of climate change on persons with disabilities, I want to turn to Pallab Regmi, who is joining us online from Nepal. Pallab is humanitarian coordinator and climate change coordinator working with CBM Nepal. He'll present a case study recently conducted by CBM-Global team on the impact of climate change on persons with disabilities in Nepal. So Pallab, the floor, the internet is yours.
Thank you so much. Namaste everyone. My name is Pallab Regmi, working as humanitarian coordinator in CBM-Global Nepal country office. It's great to be here. It's an honor for me. I'd like to thank IDA, CBM-Global, and McGill Center and UNFCCC for this opportunity to share the real case of climate change impact to the person with disabilities from impacted communities itself. Here, I'm not going to speak much about what is going at top level. I'm presenting the context, live context, as climate change is impacting the innocent people with disabilities and at-risk communities. More than a case history, this is the happening thing. This is the happening thing that we are facing for decades because of climate change, and people will be forced to face in future as well. However, we are not sure for how long we need to face this. In our context, in context of Nepal, especially in socio-economic system, agriculture is more dependent on weather patterns that existed for thousands of years. Culture and livelihood practice are developed based on long history of consistent pattern of weather. Now, our culture, livelihood are being destroyed every year. Therefore, I have a question for all of us. When monsoon or weather get angry, who do you think the most impacted one will be? Are they the people who relies on nature for subsistence livelihood? Or are they the emitters? Maybe we know the answers. So I'm going to present the case story from Nepal that happens last year. There was one disaster in July 2021. Melamchi and Helambu of Sindhupalchok district of Nepal hit hard by two devastating flash flood, resulting people's death, number of injuries, loss of properties, disrupting local economies, displacement of people from the area, and adding furthermore inaccessibility issues to the person with disabilities. In this context, CBM-Global Nepal carried out a survey with persons with disabilities of the flooded area, where it was identified that around 53% of persons with disabilities lost their shelter because of that flood, 72% of them lost their agricultural land, 73% of them lost food stock, and 19% lost the livestock and seeds. These are the statistics belongs to persons with disabilities affected by the flood in Helambu and Melamchi of Nepal. The overall impact, if we go to that area, overall impact is, we can see, even higher. So it is hard to imagine that how this kind of disaster can happen and people can impact it like this. Now I'm going to read two reflection from person with disabilities from affected area. First one is from Kamala, a woman 50 years of age with physical disability, and her husband is also deaf. Pointing to the middle of the flooded area, she reflected that my land was there and it was swept away. All is left is rock. She continued to comment, I have difficulty in walking. I cannot run like other people. I am worried how I will survive, and if similar kind of flood hit our village next time it is hard to survive again. The flood has also swept away the road in village. Now we need to walk through the flooded area filled with the dogs. It is very difficult for me to go nearby market and any kind of the facilities like hospital, because this disaster added the inaccessibility of my surrounding. There is another reflection as well from a disabled woman. Her name is Chitti, 50 years of age, who is also deaf, and her daughter Urmila, 20 years of age, living with cerebral palsy. Remembering the flood, Chitti said that I carried my daughter and we ran uphill to save our lives. But we could not save our house. It is gone now. Everything was getting dark. I started to get panicked. I carried daughter on my back. It was so much panic because I was saving life of my daughter at the same time. I could not listen what people are saying and what is happening around. When I came next day, the house was gone. I was not able to take out the foods and clothes from my house even. These two are the only two representative reflections from the person with disabilities. Recently, before 3 days, I was in the same place in Melamchi and Helambu of Sindhupalchok. For me, it was like very much hard to believe how nature could be cruel like this. Who is responsible for this? Even a year after a flood, the displaced people has uncertainty where they will go for permanent living, and they are not provided with appropriate compensation and support yet. And there is no way for people with disabilities to access the market. It is hard to believe how people with disabilities walk above those big boulders in the road, and how children with disabilities go to school with existing inaccessible surroundings. There are different kind of the reports, like IPCC reports also highlighted the extreme weather events are increasing in frequency and severity as a result of the climate change, and the impact of the changing climate are far-reaching, disrupting economies. Systems such as health and transport system are affected badly, causing the displacement of the many millions of people and impacting the physical and mental health of the old population. Out of them, persons with disabilities are the one who are impacted most, who suffer most. In context of Nepal, we have updated climate change policy 2019, and recently we have National Adaptation Plan, that is summary for policymaker that includes the person with disabilities as particularly vulnerable group. However, the efforts so far to address the issues are far behind to reach the affected in reality. At one level, it is known that climate change is happening. We know who are responsible for this. But like person with disabilities and at-risk communities who don't know like why this is happening, they are facing it exactly. The means of adaptation applied so far are not enough and not accessible as well. Therefore, at programmatic level, there is need to do with the enhancement of the skills, knowledge, resources, and support and capacity building of the person with disabilities to advocate and engage with the government at different level in different process of the development, and there is need to ensure and need to have assurance on the social security schemes as well. In addition, incorporating accessible climate smart technologies in adaptation and mitigation actions together with strengthening capacities of the OPDs and self-help group on the climate change action to raise the stronger voice against climate change are very much important. Our other recommendations are there should be meaningful participation of OPDs in the each step of the process, and there should be participation of OPDs for disaster planning and response at community level to be able to best prepare for the disaster. Building back better with inclusive approach is one of the important aspects, but building back must include investing in forecasting and anticipatory planning. In Nepal and maybe in other countries as well, there are early warning system installed in many places. However, there are many more to do to make it accessible to persons with disabilities. We need to make sure that how persons with disabilities and OPDs are able to use these systems. Similarly, use of local indigenous knowledge from communities in adaptation, any kind of the response, and then anticipatory action are very much important thing to be prioritized. At last, again, I would like to emphasize the person with disabilities, other at-risk group who don't know why this is happening and not responsible for the changing climate, why they should pay the price for that. Therefore, stop the emission, strengthen the voice of persons with disabilities to stop the changing climate. Do compensate whatever we have lost so far together with building resilience and implementation of CRPD Article 11. This is all from my side. Thank you so much all. Thank you so much again.
Thank you, Pallab. I was so pleased when I heard you say that you're not talking at the top level. We've had enough of that in Bonn this last week. You really brought to us the question of who suffers most. And description of the sort of cultural and livelihood destruction that so many people around the world are facing. And I think that it's so important to hear how well the evidence, the testimony from persons with disabilities represent the suffering of people throughout the world. Just reflecting on your informant who asked, how can nature be so cruel? The answer is it's not nature. This is man's cruelty. So we've heard some examples of the disproportionate impact of climate change on persons with disabilities. Now, what's to be done at the national level to include persons with disabilities and their right to climate adaptation? Pallab was talking about the plans from Nepal, and it mentions disability but doesn't go into any great detail. Yesterday, the Disability Inclusive Climate Action Research Programme at McGill University and the International Disability Alliance released a status report providing an analysis of disability rights in the climate policies of state parties in the Paris Agreement. And I'm going to, or my colleague will paste the link to the access to that report on the virtual platform so people can access it. I'm inviting Elham Youssefian, who's Inclusive Humanitarian and Disaster Risk Reduction Advisor for the International Disability Alliance, as one of the co-authors of the report, to tell us about the findings of that report. Elham.
Thank you very much.
It is now.
All right. Thank you very much, Jamie. Good morning, good afternoon, maybe good evening, everybody, wherever you're watching us. And thank you so much, colleagues in the room, that despite all conflicting priorities, have chosen to be with us. So I have the news that, unfortunately, the situation in Paris Agreement members is not better than Nepal. Actually, Nepal is one of the good examples that we found. With the Disability Inclusive Climate Action Research Program at McGill University, we in the International Disability Alliance did a research to look at the climate policies and commitments of Paris Agreement members to see, okay, what they have done. Because as you know, based on the preamble of Paris Agreement, they have to respect, protect, and fulfill their obligations under human rights. And one of the human rights instruments is the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. The UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, very interestingly, is a human rights convention that includes a specific article to ensure safety and protection of persons with disabilities in situations of risk and humanitarian emergency. And of course, you would agree with me that climate crisis is one of the biggest crises and emergency situations that everybody on this planet is more or less facing. So, and the other news is that almost all members of Paris agreements are also members of the UN CRPD Convention. So, with the colleagues at McGill University, and looked into the climate policies and commitments to see how much they are fulfilling their human rights obligations and how much they're including persons with disabilities. Well, the news is quote-unquote disappointing. We looked at all the national determined contributions and we found out that only 35 countries, which is less than 1/3, have a kind of mention of persons with disabilities. We looked at national adaptations policies, national climate adaptation policies, and we found out that only 45 countries have a kind of word of mention of persons with disabilities. And wait for the last, we looked at the mitigation policies, and we didn't find any country mentioning persons with disabilities. That's what we call systematic ignorance. We call systematic ignorance by governments on including persons with disabilities in their climate action policies and commitments. So even those who include persons with disabilities, like Nepal, as I said in the beginning, is actually a good example because at least they do mention persons with disabilities. But as my colleague mentioned, the way they are including persons with disabilities are among the list of vulnerable people. Persons with disabilities are vulnerable to climate change along with other people. But so most of the findings that we had, most of the countries that had mentioned disability had very cursory nature, very vague, just mentioning persons with disabilities in general. Very, very limited number of countries. And the interesting news is that those who have good ones are actually developing countries. Only one developing country we found, if you want me to mention it, is Canada. Canada is the only country we found that has good mention of disability inclusion, both in their national determined contributions and in their climate adaptation policies. I don't want to comment if they're really implementing that or not. That requires another research, maybe next year. But at least they have a good mention. But we have good countries from developing countries like Mexico. Sorry if I don't, you can look at the full report. And also yesterday there was a very interesting article published on Guardian about it that you can look at it. But there are countries like Mexico, Zimbabwe, and one more country that I don't remember right now, that do mention do include good policies and in detail. But others do not give any details about, okay, what should we do to address this exclusion? Colleagues, persons with disabilities are not vulnerable per se. Disability is a dynamic concept. If the climate information was accessible to persons with disabilities, if climate adaptations were inclusive of persons with disabilities, if persons with disabilities could access early warnings, if decarbonizing policies were established with consultation with persons with disabilities, we wouldn't be vulnerable. We would be active agents of change. We would be able to play our role in climate mitigation. We would be able to contribute in saving our planet. But the situation right now, lack of inclusive policies, lack of attention, we are struggling even to put disability in decisions that are being made right now these days. We have been struggling right now very hard to include persons with disabilities, but very, very little luck. So that starts from national level. But what I'm trying to say is that if those things would happen, we wouldn't be vulnerable. So we are not vulnerable per se. We are being pushed into vulnerability. So yeah, that's the report that we did. And we do have recommendations listed in the report, and also recommendations that we published last year just before COP26. We request all measures being taken by UNFCCC Secretariat, members of the state of Paris Agreement, and all governments to ensure that we can participate. How to provide information in accessible format, to ensure access to sign language, to captioning, to be able to provide the information in plain language, to call us, invite us to national climate platforms, to let us have focal points around the table, to come to us and ask us and let us share what barriers we face and what should be done to include us. So that's my summary for now, and if there is another opportunity at the end of the event, I will be happy to provide more details, but I want to make sure that everybody can share. Thank you so much, and over.
Thank you, Elham. It's the gaps, more gaps, and I think we've got a pretty clear idea now of the sort of gaps that are being faced at the local level, or from a colleague in Nepal, and now at the national level in terms of climate plans. As Elham says, there needs to be more work to research this. Let's hear now about the international level. In 2020, the UN Office for the High Commissioner for Human Rights published a report on the rights of persons with disabilities and climate change. So we've invited Ben Schachter, Coordinator, Environment and Climate Change, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, to speak about the rights of persons with disabilities in climate crisis and the findings and recommendations of the High Commissioner. Ben.
Thank you, Jamie, and thank you to the organizers and the speakers so far for their remarks. Climate change causes widespread human rights harms, and states have obligations to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights. States therefore have obligations to support mitigation to prevent human rights harms, adaptation to minimize those harms, and loss and damage to remedy the harms that occur. A human rights-based approach is, by definition, a disability-inclusive approach, guided by the core human rights instruments, including the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. As was mentioned, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights has produced, actually we've produced 2 reports on climate change and its impacts on the rights of persons with disabilities. These reports were mandated by the Human Rights Council. So the Human Rights Council recognized this issue, the impacts of climate change on the rights of persons with disabilities, through a resolution, 42/21, that asked our office to produce a study on this subject, organize a panel discussion, and draft a summary report from that panel discussion. I'm going to share with you some of the findings from the study, some of our conclusions about what a human rights-based and disability-inclusive approach to climate change and climate action looks like, and then be happy to hear from the other panelists and hear from you all questions that you may have later on. This study found that persons with disabilities are at greater risk from the adverse impacts of climate change owing to a variety of social and economic factors, poverty, discrimination, and stigma, which affect the exposure of persons with disabilities to the impacts of climate change. Intersecting factors related to gender, age, ethnicity, geography, migration, religion, and sex can also subject some persons with disabilities to higher risks of experiencing the adverse effects of climate change, which include impacts on their health, food security, housing, water and sanitation, livelihoods, and mobility. This study underscored all states do have an obligation to ensure their climate actions respect, protect, and fulfill the human rights of all, including through integration of the rights of persons with disabilities into climate laws, policies, and programs. I want to pause just for a moment and highlight that this study is one of a series of studies that have been mandated by the Human Rights Council over the past 7 or 8 years, addressing issues like climate change and its impacts on the right to health, climate change and its impacts on the rights of women and girls, on the rights of children's rights, on the rights of older persons. And we have extensively documented the ways that climate change disproportionately impacts some persons, groups, and peoples in high-risk situations, and the intersectional impacts. And it's important to think about all of that when thinking about climate action and climate response. We found that it was critical that more be done to take into account the requirements of persons with disabilities and to prevent climate change from exacerbating inequalities, that a disability-inclusive approach would empower persons with disabilities as agents of change, prevent discrimination against them, and make climate action more effective. I'll share with you a few of the recommendations from the report, and then a couple of thoughts about what this means for the context of the negotiations we're in right now. So first of all, we need more ambition in climate mitigation and adaptation. The best way to protect all people and their rights, including persons with disabilities and their rights, is to minimize and put a halt to climate change. We need to do more to empower people, including persons with disabilities, to respond to climate change by ensuring access to climate information, as well as meaningful and effective participation of persons with disabilities and their representative organizations in climate-related decision-making processes, to promote disability-inclusive climate action under the UNFCCC, to promote disability-inclusive climate finance, to increase the availability of data disaggregated by disability, to prevent discrimination against and abuse of persons with disabilities in emergencies, and to promote disability-inclusive climate action at other relevant forums, including the Human Rights Council and the High-Level Political Forum on Sustainable Development. Our study also looked at illustrative good practices, finding examples where action had been taken to empower communities and people with disabilities. And we have prepared another study for the upcoming session of the Human Rights Council. It's the first study of the Secretary General, or first report of the Secretary General on climate change and its impacts on human rights. It's focused on the rights of all people in vulnerable situations. And I just want to emphasize that in that report, the Secretary General also emphasizes that persons with disabilities are among the people who are most disproportionately at risk from the adverse impacts of climate change. He also highlights the key role of people in vulnerable situations to be agents of change and support the needed participatory and inclusive action that we need for transformative change. So I said I wanted to just reflect very briefly as well on the current negotiations. Action for climate empowerment is one of the items, a work plan for action for climate empowerment is one of the items being negotiated. And it's really important in that context that the rights to participation, access to information, and education are all reflected in the activities and work plan and the decision that parties are ultimately expected to adopt at the 27th Conference of the Parties on this issue of empowerment. And that, of course, has to include the rights of all people, including persons with disabilities. So we'll be pushing for and advocating for a human rights-based approach to action for climate empowerment. The global stocktake, I think, is another really critical moment for the international community to assess the way that climate change affects people. And so I mentioned before the issue of having disaggregated data and in order to better understand the human rights impacts of climate change. And so I think in crafting the global stocktake, it's really important that parties are aware of and take into consideration the way climate change disproportionately affects different groups of people, including the rights of persons with disabilities. I'll stop there, but happy to talk more later.
Thank you very much, Ben. And I think that you're adding to the gaps in this term in terms of the human rights harms and the disproportionate harms that are caused to people who are suffering from intersectional impacts, so disabilities and others, and perhaps we can talk about that in a moment. The other point that you brought out, and I'd like to emphasize, is the agency issue. It is a question of persons with disabilities agency in action, in climate action, my field in adaptation action. We find that when persons with disabilities are included, then the contributions that they can make to the actions that are needed on adaptation are phenomenal, and almost always they contribute to the protection and to the resilience of others. And I really think that emphasis on the contribution, reflecting what Elham was saying about disabled people not being intrinsically vulnerable, but actually being possible and great contributors as agents to climate action. But intersectional impacts, so we've heard that persons with disabilities who are from other marginalised groups, such as people in poverty, women and girls, children, youth and older people, and indigenous persons with disabilities experience the effects of climate change in different ways. And they have a lot of solutions and ideas to share. So our next two speakers will try to add a bit of intersectionality approach to our conversations. First, let's go to the Democratic Republic of Congo and hear from Sylvain Obedi, Executive Director of Enable the Disabled Action, which is an organisation of persons with disabilities. Sylvain is a young person with disability and has been very active in climate action the last few years. He will speak about young persons with disabilities as climate actors from a national and global level. Sylvain's first language is French, but he's been kind and brave enough to agree to speak to us in English so that we can follow his presentation, and I especially want to thank him for that. So over to you, Sylvain.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction and for giving me this opportunity to speak on this meeting As you said, I'm from Democratic Republic of Congo, and as you know, youth with disability or organization of persons with disability are not consulted or engaged in implementation of adaptation or resilience. The participation of young persons with disability in climate action, disaster risk reduction, and improving resilience to natural disaster. Our country, Democratic Republic of Congo, contains as a normative framework in terms of environmental, but which are not inclusive, depicts the fact that persons with disability make up 20% of population in my country, according to estimation, but the late are confronted with a situation of inequality and structure exclusion, while the youth are not included or do not participate in any of mechanisms of implementation of adaptation and resilience to climate change. The DRC being a climate change crisis solution country, it should be more inclusive by considering the current transition area as a unique option to address the environmental, the attitude and institutional and communication barrier focused by all these categories of disability youth. This allows for building a more inclusive and participatory community in Democratic Republic of Congo, where additional risk focused by youth with disability should be measured, addressed, and reduced with the day involving participation and leadership. Faced with the phenomenon of climate change, young people with disability have many rights and a duty toward the climate role as important and effective to play as other actor for the protection of the climate. As the world is second largest forestry community, the involvement of youth with disability can certainly contribute to the development of knowledge bases and practice to assure manifold participation and consideration of their specific needs in emergency and prepare needs to and response. As a youth activist with a disability, we ask the following: adopt the participatory and inclusive decision-making processes at all levels to assure the manifold engagement of all rights holders with a focus on those who are not most strongly and disproportionately affected by the triple global risk, particularly children and youth with disability. To recognize the achievement, sustainable and inclusive development through democratic processes must take in account all perspectives and options through the principle of freedom of expression and freedom of the press. Fail their obligation to protect and to support youth activists in implementation of Human Rights Council resolution and commitment to end the violence against young rights, lands, and justice activists, journalists, and other young people who have mobilized to build a better world. Provide manifold mechanisms for the participation of youth with disability in designing and implementation, monitoring and evaluation of key climate and sustainable development programs following the principle of meaningful youth participation as defined by UN Major Group on Children and Youth. Inquiries and investigation in children and youth, as well as support for youth organizations with disability and young entrepreneurs, recognize the investigation in children and youth as level as sustainable the future. Recognizing the voice, the perspective, the knowledge, and the expertise of youth with disability in these issues call on all governments to include national youth delegates in all international meetings and the UN Convention to prioritize the indigenous knowledge and scientific perspective in decision making, and not only see but following the advice of those with experience on environmental issues when development any policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Sylvain. That was a very telling list of requirements, and I do hope that your voice can be amplified and be heard in the centres of power, certainly around this meeting in Bonn. Your talk about the environmental and attitudinal barriers evokes lots of questions about the position for persons with disabilities and the perceptions of people around that, and how they can be a further vulnerable making factor, pushing people into positions of vulnerability where they don't necessarily need to be. I was very taken by your talk about participation, but especially your talk about leadership. And perhaps we can look at the idea of leadership in climate action a bit later on. There's so much to be unpacked from that set of demands, and I do hope that we'll be able to look at those in some detail and on paper, and they can be considered, if not before, certainly at the Conference of Parties in Sharm el-Sheikh. So we go to our last virtual stop. We're going to Puerto Rico, and we have online Gretchelle Dilán, a professor, a speaker in psychology matters, and a disability rights advocate. Her work for the disabled community in Hurricane Maria has been commended by the US Congress and also by the Puerto Rico Senate. Gretchelle represents Sustain Our Abilities, a US-based NGO working on the intersection of disability, health, and climate change. So Gretchelle will talk about the additional barriers for and contributions of women with disabilities in climate change. Gretchelle.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can you see me? Can I see my?
I can see that we have no video feed for you, but
Okay.
the sign. I think you're getting signed.
Okay. Should I wait?
If you turn on your camera, that might help.
Yeah, it's turned on.
Okay, well, we can hear you. It's a real pity that we can't see you as well. But the screen here is the sign language interpreter.
Okay.
Do you want to carry on?
Can you see me now?
No, we still don't have a video feed. Maybe if you can. Oh, I can see. We've got a picture of you now. Yes, we've got you very clearly. Thank you. Do carry on now, Gretchelle.
Okay. All right. I'm happy to be here. It's good morning here in Puerto Rico, and I know you guys are in the afternoon. So let's just start talking about women in climate change and how we are affected by uh, what's happening in our environment. So let's start talking about climate change and women with disabilities. Are the solutions or climate change free of discrimination? Women have already are in advantage in all sectors, but in this case of climate change, it's difficult for a woman to occupy government or high-ranking positions that promote female well-being because they do not see this issue as a gender issue. Even though many have classified climate change as a gender-free one. I don't know if you guys think that's correct or incorrect, but while I was reading for this convention, I saw there's a big difference, and it's a gender-free issue that we need to address. So the role of women in their culture demands to be responsible for the family, the caregiving, the cooking, the pregnancy, and all those roles have limited the participation for years. Even with the data that formalize women's opinions, create legislation with better results. Now, what participation do women with disabilities have in the issue of climate change? Well, we know this, sir. In the presentations before, we talk about the discrimination and not having our opinions with people with disabilities in all this legislation. So imagine how women that have already been discriminated, but now women with disabilities, how we can be part of that legislation and changes. How can we achieve to be in climate change legislation? When it comes to resilience, women have great ideas because of all the roles that women had in the past and how they have worked solutions. So we women know how we can be part of the changes. So it's just a matter of listening to us and to see how we have already fixed some of those problems. How can we achieve to be part of that climate change program? Well, we can start by talking about our experiences. We can add experiences of others, and we can explain how we can be surviving climate change and how can we offer ideas from our needs. Another role of women in disabilities is to show that there are different disabilities and that each has different needs that are affected by climate change. The situation derives from the fact that we really have disadvantage as women with whom we fight every day. We know all those disadvantages. And we need the presence of people with disabilities to guarantee the optimal development of our population. We need to guarantee with our experience that our needs in social and economic legislation are taken into consideration. For example, accessible transportation must not only have access, but must also be environmentally responsible. We need to ask that any equipment that is going to be replaced has to comply and has to be environmental friendly. The lack of monitoring the integration of people with disability means that people with disabilities or women with disabilities are not considered in the design and in the budget. Improving data collection and transparency on disabled women integration of climate finance programs or projects, including how projects benefit people with different handicaps. We are sure that they can foster collaboration and knowledge sharing among funders and other beneficiaries. As you know, as a local example, as you know, people with disabilities are represented in the poorest communities. People with limited incomes may face the fact that they cannot afford air conditioner in their home during heat waves, which increases the risk of a heat stroke, increases temperature, pose greater risk to disabled. And many disabilities impact on abilities to regulate body temperatures. So the combined impact of economic inequality and disabilities increases the vulnerability of the disabled. And that kind of information, we need to feed ADA legislation so that it can protect people with disabilities. The ADA legislation is the legislation that we in Puerto Rico use. It's an American Disabilities Act. And maybe other countries have their own ADA. So what we promote is that local information can be feeding the ADA legislation, so climate change could be part of the protection of the disabilities, the people with disabilities. So women with disabilities suffer from various types of vulnerabilities: poor education, lack of income, social exclusion, limited access to decision-making authorities. In the case of Puerto Rico, let's start talking about experience. Let's start talking about natural disasters that we women with disabilities have been living with. So we have, when disabilities, when disasters have been passing in that moment, we have no authority protection. So we are exposed, for example, to robbers, even family robbers. So we are exposed for a lot of vulnerabilities. But when natural disasters are occurring, we are more exposed. Let's talk about a little bit more of experience. The experience of power failure in Hurricane Maria for women with disabilities. I saw and I felt the post-traumatic disorder regarding natural disasters when it comes to people with disabilities. A lot of people lost their jobs. And for people with disabilities, it became more difficult to get back to work because it was more difficult to us to find normality in this new reality. And I go back to power failure. If I don't have power for my wheelchair, I'm not going to be, I will not be able to go back to work. So if I had a work, if I was lucky to have a work, if I confront power failure, I will not be able to go back to work. So post-traumatic disorder is not only feeling that our life is in danger, is that our jobs, our houses, our things that we have could not be able for us during and after a natural disaster. So how in 2,975 dead in 2017 Hurricane Maria. So imagine that 2,975 people. I'm sure there was a lot of disabled. We don't have that number yet, but I know there was a lot of disabled people in that number. So the lack of information, even in this number, it's part of the problem. We need to have that data so we can force to comply in climate change legislation. Then in 2020, we had an earthquake that kept us activating that post-traumatic disorder caused by Hurricane Maria. So we had a little bit of experience in the last 4 or 5 years of this natural disasters that have been very difficult to cope with. how much time do I have left?
How much do you need?
Maybe 3-4 minutes more.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about empowerment now. I know that we have a lot of plans with legislation. I know that we are asking authorities to help us now, but what about empowerment? What about us? What about what we can do us now? We can start helping us. So let's talk about quickly. I'm not going to go to each item, but let's talk about our complete personal assessment. Make a list of all our needs and resources for meeting them in a disaster environment. We need to describe our capabilities and the assistance that we need. We need to have the acknowledgement of what kind of capability we have. We need to plan we need to base our plan on the lowest anticipated level of functioning. What personal care do we need? Cooking, personal care. What water service do we need? If we need hot water, what personal care equipment like shower chair, transfer chair, another similar equipment? What adaptive feeding devices need power? What about the electricity, the equipment, dialysis, electric lifts? How are we going to be getting around if we have disaster debris? The transportation, do I need a special transportation to move? Where is my car? If I have an adaptive car, how can I protect my adaptive car? The errands, do you need help to get groceries, medication, medical supplies? The building evacuation, have we made a plan on that? The building exits, can we read the emergency signs? Are they in print? Are they in braille? How are you going to ask for help? How are you going to get out of that building? Can you by yourself? Do you need help? Who are you going to ask to? Where are the mobility aids, the ramps? And very important, where are the service animal pets? Where are they in case of emergency disaster? Where I'm going to put them? Where are they going to live? Are they close to me all the time? What about if you cannot fulfill the service animal needs? Who's going to do that for you? And who's going to help you in kind of situation of the animals? So which is their personal support network? And if you have a survival kit, we need that survival kit. Water, food, flashlights, entertainment for the anxiety, medication, multi-purpose tools, sanitation, personal documents, solar charges, extra set of keys, can openers, extra cash, towels, whistle, matches. I have a list here. Then that they later I can show you. And well, do you know how to express to people how they can help you? Sometimes we don't know. Sometimes we don't know to tell them that they cannot separate us from our wheelchair, or they cannot separate us from our animal caregiver. So we need to teach other people how they can help us. That's part of the surviving kit. So in my closing argument, my experience is what could help legislation. It's an invitation to people with disabilities to talk about their experience, how they felt. There's post-traumatic disorder that can be worked before, after, and during the disaster. So it's an invitation for this population to get involved, share their experiences, and there's no better story than our story. So I hope that my experience with Hurricane Maria and the earthquake could help climate change and could involve people with disabilities in all this legislation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gretchelle. And in a way, I thank you especially for the detail that you go into in the sort of preparations that are necessary to be able to face up to such things as a hurricane, because it does illustrate the particularities of the situation, the environment that one's in when one is faced with climate events and extreme weather events. And that detail could be replicated throughout for everybody's experience, although the items in that detail would be very different. And I think the important thing is, as you say, to talk about the experience and talk about the needs, and that principle can be translated to every environment. Also, thank you for reflecting on the complexity of needs and necessities. I mean, talking about the difficulties that some people have in regulating their temperature in heat waves. I know that medications can cause that difficulty as well. These are, as I say, it's complex, but there is a route through that complexity, and that is, as most of our speakers have said, is about participation. It's about hearing the voices, and it's about leadership, and having those people not just speaking but also setting out the plans and implementing and monitoring the actions that are taken in order to build people's resilience and to lower their vulnerabilities. And again, the key word that was mentioned was empowerment, and that's something which we taught action on climate empowerment that Ben talked about. That's one of the strands of the international negotiations, but the paucity of consideration of the complexities of disability and that multiplication of complexity that's caused by the intersectionality that we've heard about youth, we've heard about women, is something which can only really be dealt with by looking at the experiences and lived experiences. And reflecting back to our first speaker, where I mean he was transmitting the voices of persons with a disability affected by extreme events, and it's that understanding that those people have of their local situation and conditions that actually needs to be taken into account. Any questions from the floor? Welcome any questions. We have about 20 minutes left. Yes, sir. You'll be offered a microphone, and
thank you very much. Good afternoon, colleagues. And I guess my question is going to go to the colleague from the organization dealing with human rights. Is there a distinction between the concept of differently abled and disability, and just relative to the delivery of services and, you know, trying to facilitate building the resilience and all of those things? So, thank you.
Elham said to me, I can answer that, so
okay.
I'll
No, because, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. So your question is basically about the terminology of what is the difference between using differently abled and disabled or disability? So let me provide a very transparent answer to that, because we always hear people saying, yeah, you're not really disabled, you are differently able, or you are very... Listen, the concept of disability is not so my disability is not that I cannot see. My disability is the fact that I cannot see plus the barriers that I face. I always give this example to people who ask me. So let me give it here as well. It's just like, so imagine that you and I go to a restaurant to eat. If the waiter puts the menu in front of me in Braille, which is the way that blind people can read, and yours in print, we can both equally choose our food and order. If they bring the food and I can pay with my card, the card machine is accessible for me, then I can pay. So you and I are enjoying our food equally. So there is no disability in here. I am able to eat, you are able to eat on an equal basis. If the menu they put in front of me is not in Braille or is not an online format, then I am disabled. Why? Because there is this communication barrier, because the menu is not accessible for me, so I cannot read that. So the disability, the concept of differently abled or things like that come from the fact that people think that disability is because of the impairment. But the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, Article 1, uses the language of persons with disabilities and says that disability is the interaction of between the impairment, whether it's sensory, like sight or hearing, intellectual, psychosocial, or different impairments, plus barriers that can be environmental, attitudinal, communication, or institution barriers. So that's what creates disability. So differently abled is like, oh, you are not disabled, you have just, your abilities are different. The concept of disability is a dynamic concept based on the barriers. So the less the barriers, the less disability, because we are not going to face barriers in accessing our human rights on an equal basis with others. So that's why the UN Convention uses the term persons with disabilities, and we in the disability movement use the language persons with disabilities. There are some colleagues mostly based in UK, who use the term disabled person. That's also fine. There is a conversation between the two groups that you put the disabled first, or say disabled person, disabled people, or we should use persons with disabilities. We use them alternatively. But concept like differently abled just are trying to say to me that I am like a different person. No, we are like others. Some people have gender, people have different abilities, as you said, and people have race and other features. So we stick to the term persons with disabilities, but it is mostly about the same topic. I don't know if, Ben, you want to add anything to that? Maybe? Thank you.
I do not. I thank you, Elham, for building the question.
Thank you very much, Elham. Thank you very much for the question. Obviously, it's a matter of some contention, but it's really important to get a clarity of understanding about what is disabling, and obviously it's the environment that disables rather than the impairments that any person might have. Another question? Lindsay.
Hello, thank you for this wonderful event, and it's just fantastic to see the sign language and all this integrated. I have a question. Lindsay Cook, Quake United Nations Office. We walk up to a negotiator, we have 30 seconds of their attention. What do we say to them to help get that message across?
Thanks, Lindsay, and that's exactly the question that I was going to put, and I'd like to put it to all our participants, if possible. So, what would you have us say when we have our 30 seconds? Convey to parties to the convention. If you picked up the questions, Pallab, what would you have us say here in Bonn?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you clearly.
Yeah. Like again, as I emphasize that, like as people, like especially persons with disabilities and other vulnerable groups, as they are not responsible for changing the climate, so let's make a decision to stop the emissions, and then like somehow, somewhere else, like it need to be emphasized to strengthen the voice of the persons with disability strongly in what the needs of persons with disabilities they are facing. So compensate on what they have lost, what we have lost so far, together with building resilience. And we need to put something there about the CRPD Article 11, strong implementation of CRPD Article 11 as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elham.
Yeah. So they are right now discussing the global goal on adaptation. So my request would be that to make sure that inclusion for all groups, including persons with disabilities, is an important and acknowledged component of global goal on adaptation. And also they are discussing the action on climate empowerment. That would not be comprehensive if the commitment to ensure access to information is not including access to information in all accessible formats, including sign language, captioning, and plain language, and also the public participation of persons with disabilities ensured through consultation with organizations of persons with disabilities. I hope it's 30 seconds.
Thank you. Sylvain, would you like to give us your 30 seconds of contact with the parties here?
I couldn't follow very well the question. If you can repeat it.
If you have a message that you want to get to the countries that are represented here in this conference, what would you say to them? What would you want said to them?
So what I want to say to the countries who are represented there, it's only to come back on what I was saying. It's really very important. We can't plan for someone without doing it with him. It's himself who knows what kind of needs, which is priorities for him. It means that nothing can be done for us without us. We have to be present on the table in each level of the response. It's only that's the first thing, and the second one is many persons with disability or organization of persons with disability are doing the work. But the work which we are doing is not valorized. It is not recognized. And apart from that, we are not being founded. It's also another big problem. It means that to those representatives who are there, if they can see how they can begin to give funding to initiative of person with disability, to get involved for them and to see how they can valorize the work which they are doing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sylvain. Gretchelle, would you like to make your contribution to the meeting here? Is she not? Are you muted, perhaps, Gretchelle?
Can you hear me now?
You can hear you now, yep.
Okay, perfect. So in
30
those
seconds, Gretchelle.
I will just mention the post-traumatic disorder. We have worked every day with a lot of limitations. Climate change could add more limitations. So imagine the disabled people living from or suffering with traumatic disorder caused climate change. We cannot live with more fear. So the post-traumatic disorder is something that I will add because it has been proved that we in Puerto Rico and in other places have suffered from this trauma regarding climate change, hurricanes, earthquakes, and things like that.
Thank you very much, and that was a good 30 seconds. Ben, you're in a rather different position. I suppose I can ask you, what are you saying to parties when you meet them?
So One is to stop talking about urgency and to start acting with urgency. People are our greatest asset in addressing climate change, and persons with disabilities know a lot about adaptation and resilience. So, like all people, they need to be empowered through human rights, including the rights to participation, access to information, and access to justice, and being permitted to exercise those rights. And we need a framework for accountability for climate commitments that's stronger than the one we have now, that's based in human rights, and that will bring us towards the objectives of the Paris Agreement to eradicate poverty, to achieve sustainable development that leaves no one behind, and to protect human health and welfare for all.
Well, good luck with getting that message through and having parties respond to it. Are there any more questions from the floor here? Yes, sir.
Hello, hi. I'm Jonas. I work with Human Rights Watch in the Disability Rights Division. So thank you so much for this really important side event. I would like to have a comment and a question actually to the report that Elham presented together with McGill. You mentioned Canada as one of the examples where there were actually people with disabilities mentioned in official plans. I would just like to invite people here to have a look at a report that we published last year looking at British Columbia and the record heat waves that took place last summer in 2021, and actually identifying that there was a clear gap in targeted support. There was no heat action plan that was in place, and that actually led to unnecessary suffering and possible deaths of people with disabilities, but also older people. So I think it really highlights sort of the importance of bridging that also from sort of the plan and the inclusion on official national level to the implementation level. My question is to you, Elham, as well. I'm looking forward to reading the report that was published. You mentioned that there's quite a significant gap between countries in the global south, referencing people with disabilities in their plans, and countries in the global north. I have some hypotheses on why that is the case, but could you explain to yourself why that is the case? And maybe what could countries in the global north learn from countries in the global south that did include persons with disabilities? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Jonas. I'm so happy that you could join us today. I want to also use this opportunity to encourage everyone to look at that report as well, which has very strong, powerful testimonies on how persons with disabilities in one of the most advanced or claimed to be advanced places in this world, in British Columbia, were like losing their lives, livelihoods, and health because of a heat wave, because the response was not inclusive of them. They didn't think that, okay, persons with disabilities also live in this state, in this city. And we hope that the implementation of the policy that I just mentioned about adaptation works better in Canada. About your question, well, I also have some assumptions. To be very honest, first of all, it's about accountability framework. So I don't know what other things, and would love to hear what others think about that as well. But maybe one reason is that in developed countries, most of the time, the courts and justice system is more available to people to at least sue. So they're more conscious of or cautious of putting stuff in their policy and commit to things because they know that they might be held accountable. Unfortunately, in many countries around the world, the justice system is not very strong, does not allow calling for or holding governments accountable for policies, especially for policies and commitments. So that's maybe one reason. But another reason is, of course, that some of the policies are old And sometimes we actually see the fact that in some developing countries, the disability movement is acting stronger and are more involved, more at doing stronger advocacy. So that may be another reason. But I have to say that we have not looked into the reasons. So there might be other reasons that colleagues can add to this. But what they can learn is, of course, to, for example, for the national determined contributions, you know that countries have to submit them every 5 years. So for next round, and also the global stock taking is a great opportunity to look at what they have done in terms of implementing disability inclusive climate action, in terms of including persons with disabilities in climate response, and make sure that for next round they are doing better. How? By conducting consultations, inviting persons with disabilities and their representative organizations to provide input, to make sure that the consultation process are accessible. So sometimes, for example, they put it on a website, but that website doesn't work with screen reader software that blind people use. The information is not communicated in a accessible format, in a way that people can really learn what's happening and how they can contribute in that. So that's what they probably can learn. And I have to say, Jonas, that in general, as I said in my presentation, we have a systematic ignorance. So basically everybody should learn. There is not a very good student in that classroom, honestly.
Thank you. Any other presenters would like to respond to that? I must say that from the point of view of the UK, where I'm living, the UK doesn't have any mention of disability in any of its climate plans, but it does insist that countries to which it donates overseas development aid include disability in their plans. So there's an amount of learning to be done between the different ranges of government in the UK. I think we've come to quite the end, and I've been so impressed by the richness of the contributions from the presenters and also the questions from the floor, and I thank you very much for those. And thank you to everybody for their participation. If I think it's allowed to the moderator to make one final comment. And that would, Elham saying no in my ear, and that would be actually reflecting on what Sylvain was saying. He didn't use the phrase, but there's a well-known phrase from the disability movement of nothing for us without us. And I think that was the spirit of what he was saying.
The new version of that.
Go on, what is that? What was that?
The new version of that is as nothing without us. Because everything is about us, right? Anything that you do is somehow impacts persons with disabilities. So we have the new version of it is nothing without us, basically.
And I'm going to, without apology, steal that phrase.
Please, go ahead.
In order to push for the sort of necessary leadership of all peoples most affected by climate change. Yeah. Nothing without us, without those people most affected. So no prognostications from up above. It's got to involve the people most affected. And I commend the idea of locally led adaptation and the principles behind that, which essentially are 8 points of nothing without us. Thank you so much, everybody. I'm looking forward to taking some of your messages to the parties, and thank you, everybody online, and most thanks to our great presenters. And I look forward to having plenty more events on the systematic exclusion of disability, and we can turn that round and make it systematic inclusion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.